Okay, I have returned, and I'm still talking about PHP. In fact, probably the thumbnail of this this video is almost exactly the same as the last one because I've moved so very little in this, but I've done a lot of talking, and I hope that that's useful. So, um, getting back to where I was. So I was talking about return types and documentation, or was going to. So here you can see that I've got a bit of copy and paste here. I've got this thing, this line defining what is acceptable and how variables get into this, and I've got this other line that's documenting it, and it's almost exactly the same. So this is a thing that happens. This is a thing that you just get in code. And it's a bit of a problem. So in particular, you might well find you can easily end up with documentation contradicting what's in the code, and that's no good. But also, if you update it, you have to update it in two places, and it just gets to be a mess. It gets to be a mess if you keep doing it. It's very easy as well to just forget to put something in the documentation. It's very, very easy. So unless you've got like a really good static code checker, you might want to not document arguments if the documentation is not going to be any more than is already present in the declaration line. So it's perfectly possible to just not have the param line. I would say actually on this matter, so you should have a look at PSR 12, I think 12, the coding standards PSR. Again, I previously described in, I think, the first PHP video what a PSR is and where you find those. But yeah, there is a generally accepted standard for how code works. And in particular, if you're going to be publishing your code, you should be compliant with what that is. But I think actually as far as documentation is concerned, because PSR 5 is not properly documented, because it's not standardized, I think it actually just requires that you use appropriate documentation, which would probably be fine. Anyway, yeah, so if all of the arguments are ones which you're not actually saying anything about, then you may omit all of the param directives. And if the return value is one that you're also not communicating anymore with, you might omit that as well, because then at least any documentation processor will know that the definitive source of truth for those is going to be the actual description of what the method is. You can sometimes be in a position where you might go halfway on this. You might have a small amount of information. If you do that, it's technically valid, again, technically, to have at param and then a name and then just some text, whatever the text might be. And that may be something that you might seek to do to avoid copying and pasting this enormously long name. There are actually ways in general to avoid typing enormously long names. Normally, I don't follow them because it's more helpful to see the full name wherever it's used. But yes, there are other ways to do that. So if you want to know about that, you should go to php.net and look for use. And it's the use that's not the one for traits, but the one that's for aliasing. Anyway, so here we've got return type, and then you've got an open curly, and this is standard for how you express a block of code. If I were in Python, there would be no open curly because Python lives in the Wild West, where everything's just inferred. But here we've got open curly. We can have a whole complicated discussion about exactly how useful it is to do that kind of thing, to do non explicitly delineated blocks. But when it comes down to it, it's just two different ways of writing it. So the PHP way with the curlies is a very common one, and it's perfectly clear. I don't think it's really a problem. I know that when you've got cases like Python where indentation is important, people do get themselves in a mess when they paste stuff. Even if their editor kind of understands that pasting should be re-indented at an appropriate level, it's easy to end up accidentally not having precisely the right indentation for something, and then suddenly you've got a different block. And yeah, that's kind of the downside of that one. But mostly it's manageable. It's not a particularly big problem. So, right, so mostly in PHP, well, in fact, there's not even any mostly about this, you cannot declare variables. What kind of world is this we're living in where you can't declare variables? Well, I don't know, but that is the world of PHP, at least at the current version. So you can't say that there is a variable called body contents. And this is something that's particularly meaningful because, yeah, and I guess that's relevant here. So you can see I've got $K here as a value. You might not really understand what it's doing there, but there is $K. $K is a thing that exists there. As it happens in PHP, $K would still exist down here if I were using it. I mean, it's possible it might not. I might be contradicting myself. But, I mean, certainly if it had been assigned, if it had an equal sign, it would still be present. But there might be some special source for each in this case. But yeah, in general, if you have something that's in a block, yeah, like this $B equals here, that value will still be set, and it will still be exactly the same on the second pass through this, and it would also be exactly set and the same below the while thing. So $B here is still a thing, and that can create a problem because you might have done this loop 0 times. You don't know, and if you have done it 0 times, in fact, PHP, when you come across the last line there, or it needs a semicolon, but whatever. When you come across that last line, PHP would say, wait, this doesn't exist, and it would emit a little warning for you. In fact, it might be that the very latest version might emit an error for that. But yeah, it's a kind of a complicated mess because you can very easily just end up just not knowing what variables there are that you can use. And like a common way of making a mess of things in PHP is typos. If you have a very small change, you can't tell anymore that what you've got there is not actually a variable. And in fact, so PHP won't care until it starts running it, and then when it does start running it, it'll say, "Oh, you can't do for each on that," and it'll probably crash. But yeah, it's so nothing is declared, and in principle, if you had that, so if you had both of those changes, that would make a series of code that, in principle, maybe could actually work. So the compiler would just look at that and think, well, I don't know, that sounds about right. I can see an assignment there, must be working. But actually it won't be. So you can't have declarations as it happens. And that is a bit of an annoyance. You can declare constants. It's just uncommon to see those in code apart from class constants. And those are usually only used for completely public code. So here, this is what you would commonly do in PHP in lieu of a declaration. You would just, where you would put a declaration line, you do put an assignment. And in particular, if you have a value that you think you might never assign, but you still want to use it after you perhaps never assign it, you probably would put an assignment to null at the top. So that will have the same return value. It won't complain about it, and it will be easier for you to tell when the code has gone through a weird path and genuinely genuinely is using a value which has never been defined. So in other words, if you are thinking that I explicitly intend this thing not to be defined under some circumstances, then you should assign it the value null, because that will be much saner. So in PHP, you don't have a definition between null and undefined, or null and really anything else that's nullish. So you just have null. You would just assign to null. So it does internally have a concept of whether the variable exists in the namespace at the time. That's what it will complain about. But in terms of what the returned type is, the return type will be just null. And if you did is null on it, it would be true. And if you did equals 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 null, that would also be true though. So here I'm assigning to an empty array. Again, in PHP, it doesn't consider associative arrays to be different to true arrays. So in other words, every array is in fact a key value map, which you can do certain true array operations on. And this is actually an area in which PHP is quite confusing, because there are certain methods that you can call, like array merge, which operate differently on true arrays than they do on associative arrays. And if you've got a mix, in fact, in that case, yes, you end up with quite an inconsistent output. So anyway, each statement in PHP needs to end with a semicolon. That's just the way it is. Who knows? In some future existence, they might need to not need to end in semicolons, but that's the way it is at the moment. So a semicolon means that the parser immediately understands that you're done. There's no ambiguity, and of course that's the case in a great many languages. In fact, probably most of them. And that can be used to have multiple statements on one line, but usually you would not put multiple statements on one line because it's just bad code. Just don't do that. You might notice that I've used underscores here in the variable name. That's following convention that I remember being the case. This is something that isn't very strongly standardized in PHP in the same way as it isn't in a lot of other languages. You can have variable names in mixed case instead, perfectly fine. What I do is I use underscores for variables, and usually so there are some exceptions to that, but for methods, because they actually do have a standard defined, use camel case, I think this is, but the one with the, so you just put a capital letter at the beginning of each subsequent word. And in fact, normally, where I can, I put the things in alphabetical order. That's so in this kind of context, it doesn't really make any difference. But there are situations where you might see a lot more of them, and it makes it easier to spot ones that are similar, as long as they have sensible names. And you can see that these names basically are just nouns with, well, yes, they're just nouns, in fact. They could be nouns with adjectives, but yes, they're essentially just nouns. This is actually, this is kind of a complicated case, because I normally advise against using these super short variable names. But I get a bit more specific with this. I would say don't use super short variable names unless it's going to be finished in a very short time. So if it's going to be, look at this. This isn't even used. This is where static analysis would have been good, but whatever. This line should not exist. I'm going to delete it. But there are cases where you're not really going to get. So I've got some updates available. I'm not going to install them. Yes, so there are cases where you where you might have something which is so cryptic that that you're not going to spell it out, or it's so long that you're not going to spell it out. And in those situations, you might use a shorter name. But in general, you want to have ones that can be parsed in English so people understand. Um, and actually, so words like requests are actually very, very bad ones because they've got a lot of different meanings, meanings in context, but I mean also different meanings in English. So I don't know where these things are. In fact, I mean I could call them PSR request interfaces, but that's not particularly helpful. Um, that's just one of the problems that you have with programming, really. That often you have terms which could mean multiple things, and you kind of have to use those as the variable names. It's just a shame. So strictly speaking, these things are variable. I did mention that you can declare constants. So these are variable. You can do stuff with them. You can modify them in place, and you can reassign them, in other words. But mostly that's not of any great relevance unless you are inside a if you're inside a for loop. So here, in here, that life would actually be very slightly different if you had an array there, because arrays are passed by value, strictly speaking. Not perhaps in practice, but they are, in terms of how the code works, they're passed by value, and that means that although you may do a whole lot of things inside the for each loop to a value that was passed into it, it's not actually going to change the outer one, which can be a pain in the ass. And you would put an ampersand at the beginning if you wanted to do that, but there's no need to do here because these things are all objects. So objects are always passed by reference. Okay, so this is a for each loop. It does something for each of the things in an array, in this case. Somewhat interestingly, this is using an indexed array, a plain array, as an associative one. It didn't have to be doing that. If I were just doing the associative style, I would just do it without the k and the equals greater than. I didn't want to save that. No, thank you. So the syntax for this in PHP is for each, and then an iterable thing, which normally is an array, but it can be other things, and then the word as, and then either just the value that it will have inside here, or the key in the value. So inside this for each loop, the values of k and request will be 0 and some object, and then 1 and some other object, and then 2 and some other object, etc., until you've actually reached all of the requests. And when the last request has been done, you will just be down here. So if you're not familiar with how a for loop works, essentially it's while there is stuff to do, it will go into this block here that's delineated with curly brackets. And at the closed curly bracket, it will move on to the next thing, whatever the next thing is, and then go to the open curly bracket if there actually is a next thing, and then it will do things on whatever the next thing is. So here, I'm using iterators, because I'm being fancy. I'm being super fancy. This is something that you might look at and be a little bit scared of if you've come from older programming code. But for modern callers, particularly where you don't have a reason to suspect that somebody will actually have compatible code that they're trying to copy over, there's not a reason not to do this. And there are some reasons to do it. In particular, you might be thinking that you've got a lot of code that may run in here. As it happens in this case, I don't, but you could. And you yeah, so you might be thinking that you'll give whoever's calling an opportunity, if they should desire it, to run some of their code in between. And in particular, that's something that can be useful for writing files, for communicating with the network, or communicating with the user, um, just to indicate that progress is being made rather than just sitting there and the world ends. So this yield statement means that if there is something which is using the return value of run iterator inside a for each itself, which I know might kind of explode your brain, then that will get a subsequent value of whatever this is, and whatever this is as the value. So you can also do yield statements just with a value rather than with a key and value. So like this. And technically, actually, in this case, that would still work, but I wouldn't actually want to do it here. I'd want to keep it as it is, essentially. And on the right here, we've got a single string, which is built up from a series of substrings. This is using dots for concatenation, because that's the concatenation operator in PHP. Comes from Perl, ultimately. And yes, each of these are just things which return a string. So the request object has a method called getHeaderLine, which takes an argument, which in this case I've filled with the words content type, and it returns a string, and that means it will work to have all of these things put together. Strictly speaking, the compiler may actually optimize some of this away. It might look at subsequent static strings and just decide that that's really just one string. But it doesn't matter as far as you're concerned, and there's not really a significant value in optimizing those things at this kind of level. So, yes, so after this yield, we're doing a bit more work. So this is doing an array map. PHP, very big on array functions. This is a horrible quirk of the age of PHP, is that it has object methods as a concept, but for the earliest implementations of those, which is particularly ones which are for primitives, including arrays, those are actually functions with the object type name and then an underscore, and then what the method will be called. And ideally, with these, they take the actual objects as the first argument, and then they take the rest of the stuff as subsequent arguments. Array map, in fact, is an exception to this case because it was copied from Perl, and Perl always took the thing to do before the thing it was operating on. So it's a whole complicated mess. You can see the function definition here. Now, this actually I think is something that has changed in the very latest PHP, maybe, hopefully. I haven't looked. I will have to look. But you can see it's this very, very verbose declaration. It's actually passing in an anonymous function, and that anonymous function will be called with the value as an argument for each subsequent value of $requests, and then the thing it returns will be included in the output, which is just, yeah, it's just very, very complicated. And this is just the way you have to write it. But so there may in future, or perhaps even right now, be like a shorthand syntax that's available for it. But in any case, this is how it works. This is how it works for most code that you encounter. And yeah, this function is one that's fairly common. You see it quite a lot in PHP. If you don't know what map does, it simply takes an array of things as input and produces an array of things as output using a single function to replace each element of the array. That's what it does. It doesn't change anything for the original array. It just produces a new array with different output in it, or perhaps the same output in some cases. you can see here it's doing an empty string and concatenating that. That's a meaningful thing in PHP because uh, you can have a to string method, which is, I think is underscore underscore to string. I'll really have to check. I don't remember, but you can have so each class can actually have a native string representation, and that is the thing that that you would get when concatenating it with a string. Here, I've request get body actually returns a body object, but a body object also has a string representation, which is the data that was transferred, or the data to transfer rather, and that's the data that's the value that I want. I just want the data that's transferred. So casting it to string like this is a way that you can do that. So down here we've got a while loop. This is something that I would hope if you're at all familiar with programming you would understand, but in essence it will keep doing this thing as long as $bodies is true. For PHP that means it's not the empty string, it's not 0, it's not false, and it's not null. And I believe the string 0 would be false in this case, which is perhaps a pain, but whatever. That's how it is. Then we've got another for each loop here and another yield. So substories just takes part of the string. It's very common. This is a POSIX thing, in fact. And this is doing this is doing an associative array assignment. I haven't actually got any other. Yes, I haven't got any other array assignments here. Actually, am I using? I'm not even using body contents. Oh, this is just bad code. Please ignore all of this code because none of this should be here. Yeah, not using header contents either. Not using headers finished. Well, look at that. Look at how little work it's doing. That's just pathetic. Okay, so yes. So this is using associative array syntax. Technically, it's the same as indexed array. So it would work in the same way as if it were an indexed array, but technically this $k could be a string or it could be a number. Either of those would be possible. But yeah, so the way this works is you have the name of the array, open square bracket, then where you're dealing with something, where you want to look in the array, then close square bracket. And if you just had that as an expression, that would return the value that was in there. If you have an equals after it, it changes the value that is in there. And yes, so there are situations where an array's been copied in. So here that's not the case. It's just the same bodies that's defined up here. So everything is fine. So this is actually, yes, this is actually well, this isn't even appending. Yeah, this is modifying $bodies at a particular offset, and then yeah, when it's empty, it's then it's indicating it's yielding with nothing. Okay, that actually is fine. So this is essentially dumping out blocks repeatedly with the same key on them, which isn't something that you can. So you can't have that in a real associative array. Only one thing can have a given key, but inside of for each loop that will work just fine. So this essentially just gives you like a key and a value, and it keeps emitting the same key with like the next chunk as the value until it reaches the last chunk, and that one is empty, and then it throws away the rubbish that it has at the end. So onset is a PHPism, and again it's an array thing, although it's so technically this will work with variables. You can use that to remove a variable from the namespace, I believe, but this is the format that you would see it in. So this removes the entry with the key k from the array. In fact, so it just removes it completely. You can do something similar by saying $bodies square bracket $k close square bracket equals null. But that is semantically a little bit different. In particular, if that were the case, then this for each loop would continue to run. It would be running forever. So in this case, I actually need to remove the keys and values so that they're not in the next pass of the for each loop. Okay, so again, I've talked a bit too long, but I hope it's been informative. Thank you for watching.